today, Laura Little. Laura Little is the James G. Schmidt Chair in Law and Senior Advisor to the Dean at Temple's Law School, specializing in constitutional law, conflict of laws, and federal courts. An award-winning teacher and scholar, she has taught in Rome, Tokyo, Beijing, and beyond. Professor Little has written numerous books and articles, most recently, Guilty Pleasures, Law and Comedy in America. The American Law Institute appointed her to serve as associate reporter for the next restatement of conflict of laws. Professor Little practiced law in Philadelphia and was a law clerk for Chief Justice William Rehnquist of the U.S. Supreme Court. Please welcome Professor Little.
Behind a podium, so
You can take that out if you want.
no, I'll just leave it there if that's all right. But please let me. I've been a law professor for 30 years, and I like to think I have lung capacity. So let me know if you can't hear me. So I'm delighted to be here. I've always heard about the Ethical Society, but this is actually my first time, and I was pretty impressed when I got out of my car and there's a picture of myself on Rittenhouse Square. So thank you very much. As you might have figured out from the introduction, I've spent most of my professional life thinking about, writing about, and teaching about sort of highly technical, abstract concepts. For those of you that are lawyers in the crowd, my specialties are primarily conflict of laws and federal jurisdiction. For those of you that are not lawyers, it is in fact lawyer's law, but even lawyers and judges tend to hate those disciplines. So for whatever reason, as my mother would say, if those dogs are going to jump in your lap, you might as well pet them. So I've spent most of my professional time focusing on that. But, you know, a woman has to have some fun. And I wanted something to focus my professional energy on that was a little closer to humanity. It's not that these legal topics have nothing to do with people's lives. They're actually extraordinarily important to people's lives, but they're sort of one step or two step removed from influencing actually what happens in the world. But comedy and humor is like directly impacts us. It's part of our day-to-day life. I've always been sort of fascinated with humor. I can remember in undergraduate school I wrote, I'm almost ashamed to admit this, but I wrote a paper for a linguistics class on the syntax of malaprops. So it's always been something that I've focused on. And
Syntax
of malaprops. Go figure. Anyway, I came up with it myself. I have to own it. Oops. So I've always focused on it and thought that, in fact, it would be a good way to, use my professional energy and my professional knowledge, but have a little bit of fun in connection with the other work I do. So the first thing I did was I joined a professional association, which is, this is not a joke, the International Interdisciplinary Society for the Study of Humor, which is in fact a very serious group of scholars that look at various different angles on what makes things funny and how humor operates. So we're talking about, there's not a lot of lawyers, it's kind of fun to be the only lawyer in the group actually, but there's a lot of literary scholars that analyze the literature of comedy and what makes things funny in that regard. There's therapists, psychiatrists, and the like that talk about the therapeutic value of humor. There's communication scholars. I could go on and on. It's a really very rewarding, lovely group of people. Some people are funny, and some people are actually a little tedious. It's part of life, you know. There's even a Japanese gentleman from Japan who's an engineer and has developed a laugh measuring device that's very useful to other scholars that are doing studies to try to evaluate what makes a belly laugh and what makes a chuckle. So it really is a very interesting group of people. So that was my first step, and my second step was just to find out about theories of humor. And you won't be surprised that there's lots and lots of writing on what makes things funny and how comedy operates. But there is actually some consensus on like three categories of comedy, or three categories of humor. One is probably the oldest lineage, known as superiority humor. Goes back to Cicero and Aristotle. Also sort of made very popular by, not surprisingly, Thomas Hobbes, which focuses on superiority humor. That is, when we ridicule people, we make fun of people, we tease people, sort of to make ourselves feel better at their expense. Another category that's generally agreed to be sort of a genre of humor is release or relief humor. Also, not surprisingly, it was the brainchild of Freud, and the idea is that there's certain topics that, as humans, we are uncomfortable with. Your favorite things: incest, excrement, death. To give you some examples, and that we use jokes to process our anxiety about these matters and release our tension. The final category, which is actually the one that's most embraced by legal thinkers and humor scholars, is incongruity. That is, what makes us laugh? Well, often it's the juxtaposition of two things that we don't expect to be together. That is, it surprises us to hear them together, and that's, it's said, the spark for a joke. Now, lots of things can be incongruous, but not necessarily funny. So, for example, if I drove my car across Rittenhouse Square, you wouldn't expect that. It's incongruous, but if I hurt somebody, it certainly wouldn't be funny. So the notion is that incongruity is not necessarily a sufficient condition for a joke, but many believe it's a necessary condition for a joke. And these are not discrete categories, so that you might have one joke that has all three qualities. There was a social scientist that purported to come up with the world's funniest joke. I don't think it's necessarily that funny, but it gives you an example of how all three can come together. You want to hear it? Yes. Yeah. Women aren't joke tellers. They're more situational in their comedy. But whatever. Here you go. So there were two hunters out in the wilderness, and one all of a sudden, collapses and appears to be dead. And the other hunter, is disturbed, takes out his cell phone and calls 911. The operator answers and he says, "Help, please try to get emergency personnel here. I'm out in the woods, it's very remote, but I need help. I think my friend is dead." And the operator says, "Okay, let's first make sure that he's dead." At which point the hunter says, "Hold on a second," and the operator hears in the background, boom, 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 boom. The hunter gets back on the phone and says, "Okay, he's dead." Right, that's the joke. It's superiority humor because the hunter was, who would interpret those instructions as an order to shoot your friend. It's release humor because it deals with something that's uncomfortable, your friend dying, etc. And it's incongruity humor because what kind of fool would interpret those instructions to shoot your friend? So you see how this operates. So armed with these theories, which I didn't come up with, but are very, very respected in the literature, I decided to look at my first project was to look at four different areas of the law: contract, trademark infringement, defamation, and the final being sex discrimination or employment discrimination. And I picked those categories mostly, actually, to be honest, because there's a lot of raw material. There's a lot of cases that had jokes in the facts. Often it was just a joke, as the defense to the particular lawsuit and the like. They also happen to represent the three pillars of common law. That is contract representing contract, the law of wrongs being represented by employment discrimination to some extent has some contract connotations, but the law of wrongs being represented by employment discrimination and defamation, and property law, the third pillar being represented by trademark infringement. And I looked at these just wondering whether or not, in fact, I could find some trends or some themes, particularly going to the question of what types of comedy or jokes do lawmakers and courts, which are sometimes lawmakers, what types do they prefer? Under what circumstances do they protect the joke? Do they say no damages, no lawsuit, you're allowed to say this, either because the First Amendment, freedom of communication, kicks in, or because of some quality in other aspects of the law? And what other types of humor does the law step in? It allows damages, it enjoins it, there's criminal liability, etc., so that in fact it's muzzling the joke. It's providing an incentive actually to avoid that type of humor in the future. I didn't necessarily expect to find any trend, but to my surprise, there did seem to be something there, which was that courts and lawmakers tend to prefer jokes, and to protect them from liability and the like, tend to prefer jokes that have a lot of incongruity. And there can be another number of reasons for that. That is, incongruity is much more cerebral. Judges are well educated. So it's like a higher class form of communicating, or whatever reason you may come up with. And I'm happy to. I don't have a huge amount of time to go through all my evidence for this thesis in this opening statement. But I'm most happy to give you some examples from the case law in each of these categories, because some of them are really quite a hoot. But I'll give you one example of what I'm trying to say, and that is contract. You might say, what? Contracts? Jokes? Like, that doesn't really go together. When I think of contracts, I think of boring legalese, long documents, and the like. Well, there's not a huge amount of joke cases dealing with contracts, but there's enough to actually get a sense of how jokes and humor comedy come up in that area of law. It used to be the older cases dealt with sham marriage, or instances where someone got drunk with another friend and wrote on a cocktail napkin, "I'll sell you my farm for your horse." Wake up the next morning and the person that was going to get the farm says, "Okay, we got a contract. Where's my farm? You can have my horse." And the defense says, "Well, it was just a joke." Those are a little less interesting, but in today's world, it actually comes up a lot with advertisements. Like, if you've noticed, advertisements tend to be sort of a little wacky and creative these days to get your attention. And I think perhaps my favorite contract case dealt with the Pepsi Company. The Pepsi Company had created this marketing campaign to sell more Pepsis, obviously. But it was based on the notion that you should drink a lot of Pepsis, collect the bottle tops, which had a notation that you get a certain number of Pepsi points. And if you collected a lot of the Pepsi points, then you could get valuable merchandise, right? That is, so you collect a lot of bottle tops, a certain number of Pepsi points you could trade in for good stuff. And they had an advertisement in which they featured a teenager and a Harrier jet. And the premise was a Harrier jet, you know, the military equipment that takes off this way. So the notion was that this teenager had gotten a Harrier jet as a mode of transportation because he had collected sufficient Pepsi points. And it has a picture of him, or it has some footage of him. You can see this on YouTube. He picks up his backpack, he puts it around his shoulder, his parents throw him the keys to the Harrier jet, he gets in the Harrier jet, he goes to school, he lands, and the next frame is, sure beats the bus, 7 million Pepsi points. So that the idea here is that you could get a Harrier jet if you collected 7 million Pepsi points. Well, some kid in New York came up with a scheme to collect 7 million Pepsi points. You know, it was a fairly complicated scheme, but he succeeded. And he then went to the Pepsi Company and he said, I have my 7 million Pepsi points. Where's my Harrier jet? The Pepsi Company said, as you might imagine, it was just a joke. But he insisted, and believe it or not, filed a lawsuit, and one of our nation's proudest forums, the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, had to adjudicate whether or not, in fact, this advertisement was just a joke. How did it do it? Well, it used incongruity theory, to go back to my thesis. That is, it said, okay, let's look at this advertisement. Let's talk first about the idea that a teenager that you couldn't trust with his parents' car keys would use a piece of military equipment that's designed to search and destroy surface targets as a mode of transportation to school. Let's also look at just the exaggerated adolescent fantasy of owning a Harrier jet. Finally is the absurdity that someone could actually drink enough Pepsi to amass 7 million Pepsi points. So because this is so, I mean, they didn't use the word incongruous, but that's what they were getting at. You couldn't have accepted the advertisement as a true offer that was capable of acceptance to give rise to a binding legal obligation, otherwise known as a contract. That it was clearly just a joke. So that's an example of how you might not expect it, but kind of funny things start to touch on serious legal topics. So as I said, I have examples in the other categories of law, but for the most part, things that are highly cerebral and have elements of incongruity tend to be preferred, both by actually the rules of law and their application by courts.
We want to know if the kid won or lost his suit.
Oh, the court said it was just a joke. It's not an enforceable contract. Get out of here. Right. So that was the bottom line. Sorry, I didn't make that clear. So other ways. So this is law's effect on humor. What type of humor does the law encourage, and how does law sort of have some influence? Another couple just interesting ways that you can think about are censorship humor. There's a whole genre of comedy that makes fun of censors or that actually uses the tools of censorship to create comedy. So that's very interesting in that when the law operates to actually try to muzzle things, it's kind of like a balloon that the productivity and the creativity is going to come in elsewhere, in that it creates a whole mode of humor from trying to stifle human communication. Another really interesting example, at least for me, is an instance where actually the law doesn't work, or it's not working very, very well. And that has to do with stand-up comedians. It used to be that stand-up was very much connected with vaudeville, and joke stealing was not a big deal. People took each other's material all the time. What gave you your unique qualities is how you dressed, how you danced, the music you used. But the underlying material was something that you might have ripped off from somebody else, and that wasn't a big deal. But in the contemporary world, the actual material, the jokes that stand-up comedians are using are quite valuable to them, and the uniqueness of them is something that gives them and their act a lot of value. Well, people rip off people's jokes all the time. One stand-up comedian might take somebody's joke and make it their own in their own set. So what do you do about it? Well, there's a little bit of a debate about whether jokes are copyrightable. I think they certainly are. But the point is that comedians don't bother to do what you need to do in order to get real damages for someone that rips off basically your property, your intellectual property. That is the substance of your joke. So the law is not providing them with protection for something that's very important to them. So what do? They beat up on each other. They're savage. If you ever pay a lot of attention to stand-up, they're savage in ripping on people that steal jokes. So it's a form actually of self-regulation, that the law is not really working, but it's inspiring a whole mode of comedy in terms of, it being a form of superiority comedy, in terms of making fun of others that steal jokes. And so there's some hilarious routines, if you want to take a look on YouTube, of comedians doing this. So that's law's effect on humor. For the purpose of my book, I also looked at humor about the law, right, making fun of legal things, as well as humor in the law. So humor about the law is jokes, comedies, etc., that make fun of judges, juries, the legal process, the complications in litigation, and probably the most sort of popular mainstream type of comedy about the law, lawyer jokes. I happen not to be a fan of lawyer jokes. I know that's, probably predictable. But I think I have a reasoned basis for it. And that is, I don't think they're generally very funny. And I think people know they're not funny. They're outworn tropes, but they nonetheless flourish. So in the book, I talked a little about lawyer jokes, because you can't talk about the intersection of law and humor without talking about lawyer jokes. But there's actually some very, very insightful studies by legal academics about why lawyer jokes are so popular. And probably the most persuasive explanation for me, you can decide if you're persuaded, is that people don't hate lawyers. They want their kids to become lawyers, right? They pay for law school, and they need lawyers. But when they need lawyers, the person on the street is generally in a vulnerable position, right? Somebody has died, their kid's been busted, they're trying to buy some piece of real estate, and it's kind of financial stress, and they're nervous about it, and the like. So because they're in this sort of submissive position, they're not so happy about the person that has power over them and knows more than they do. So that's the gist of the theory about why we like, it's a sort of an idea of release. We're letting some tension out about being in this subordinate position. So that's lawyer jokes. There is a really funny cartoon in the book, and so I can't explain, you can't always explain why you think something's funny, but it's a picture of a bird feeder. Somebody's looking out their window, and in the bird feeder, there's like a lawyer's arm and a lawyer's legs and a briefcase sort of sticking out. You don't see the rest of the body, and the caption is, "Damn thing's supposed to be lawyer-proof." I thought that was pretty cute. But for the most part, I don't think they're very funny. I don't think judge jokes are particularly funny either. The categories are very predictable. You have the pompous judge, you have the vain judge, the black robe disease judge, the superior attitude judge. So, I don't know what it really contributes to human discourse, but maybe it's a way of releasing your anger about judges. So that's another category. There used to be a lot of jury jokes, like the stupid jury, many of whom like the cartoons focused on like sort of the trivial female juror that wanted to get her hair done rather than to do her duty and sort of consciously and deliberatively evaluating facts and applying law. So that's another category. That's humor about the law. Finally is comedy that actually funny stuff that arises from law itself. I call that humor in the law. And I actually happen to believe that some of the funniest stuff in life actually is very spontaneous and organic to a particular situation. So, not a formal joke, not a formal routine, but just something as humans we share together that gives rise to a chuckle. And that's what I would use that observation to explain why there's all this great stuff of humor in the law. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's funny court opinions. Usually it's courts, judges thinking they're funny, but usually they are pretty funny. Things that happen during court proceedings, like funny colloquies that take place in the litigation process, just foibles of witnesses and lawyers and judges that particularly if you have to deal with on a regular basis, like this sort of ritualized way of interacting, known as a court proceeding, when this funny stuff happens, it's enhanced because it's something that you wouldn't expect. It's incongruous that the defendant would start cursing at the judge. Well, that wouldn't ordinarily be that funny, but in that context, it's so unexpected that you chuckle. There's also funny case facts. That is just things in life that gave rise to a dispute that was filed as a lawsuit. And believe it or not, there are few funny statutes that I found. They're not knee slappers, right? But I think they sort of bring a smile to your face. So here's an example. And if you don't think it's funny and you think it's mean, that's fine. I understand. But the United States Criminal Code has a provision that makes it a crime. It's punishable by a fine, but it makes it a crime to carry a switchblade. Now, that's not surprising, right? Switchblades can be very dangerous. Why would somebody want to carry a switchblade? We're just trying to discourage people from carrying this dangerous weapon. But there's an exception. It is not a crime to carry a switchblade if you're a one-armed person. Oh no. It really said something about someone's sense of humor if they immediately laugh at that. I thought it was completely rude. But I do think it's a little mean, but it makes a lot of sense, right? You have a reason to carry a switchblade if you only have one arm. Anyway, so moving on. Sometimes these things fall flat. Funny case facts. One of my favorite is a case that actually you all may have heard about. It's a relatively recent case, and it deals with the Monkey Selfie dispute. So some people may have heard of it, but I think a lot of people haven't. So the facts are like this. There was a primatologist who was studying macaque monkeys, a group of macaque monkeys. And he was in the field, he had a camera, and he had like a notebook or a pad to take notes about how they were interacting with each other. So he puts down the camera for the purpose of taking notes. And apparently macaque monkeys have, a high degree of intelligence. One of the monkeys picks up the camera and starts snapping pictures of himself. We now know that this monkey's name is Naruto. You can Google it, Monkey Selfie, and the pictures are precious. Naruto's selfies of himself are, he's got the yellow teeth, and he looks really happy, and so they're wonderful pictures. The primatologist later discovers that this occurred, and he posts the selfies on the internet, right? And it turns out he gets a lot of benefit from it because, they're funny, they're entertaining, it's a high visibility. Anyway, he gets some mileage out of these selfies. Well, the general principle of law is that the copyright to a photograph is owned by the entity that snapped the picture, right? So an animal rights organization, which you've probably heard of, PETA, People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, right, decides that they're going to assert Naruto's copyright rights as next friend, which is a legal fiction that, one person's suing on behalf of another who's not in a position to assert their own rights. So PETA files a copyright suit on behalf of Naruto saying that the primatologist had violated the copyright. I guess trying to get some sort of compensation for Naruto or prevent this from happening in the future. The primatologist immediately files a motion to dismiss. There was a federal court suit, files a motion to dismiss the lawsuit. And the brief in support of the motion to dismiss, I think, is one of the only examples that I can think of where a lawyer trying to be funny in the process of the court proceeding actually did the client well. That is, the joke worked rather than backfire. So why do I think this? Well, this is the joke. This is the brief in support of the motion to dismiss the copyright suit on behalf of the monkey filed by PETA. Okay, so it goes like, the first paragraph goes like this. A monkey, a primatologist, and an animal rights organization walk into federal court. What sounds like the setup of a joke is actually happening. This case must be dismissed. Monkey see, monkey sue is not good law. Why do I think this worked? Well, they won the motion to dismiss, number one, but even more revealing, the court's opinion in support of the decision to get rid of the case quoted that particular paragraph at the beginning of the opinion, right? So it seemed to be quite effective. So those are just some examples of law's effect on humor, humor about the law, humor in the law. Personally, what's ahead for me, a couple things that I'm trying to think a lot about lately, they kind of distill to the idea of social change in humor and the effect of comedy on social change. One thing that's very, intriguing these days, if you think about, these are unusual times in the United States, and it's very interesting that, in fact, satirical news programs are flourishing, right? You've got Colbert, you've got Noah Trevor, etc. The late night comedy shows are actually a way that young people get their news, but they're very, very much targeted on our current president of the United States. So why is that, and what is the effect of this flourishing of satire? One idea is that this type of satire may actually inspire people to do something about it. Right? That is, it ridicules something that should be ridiculed and gives you the idea that it should be changed. By contrast, it could also be that we watch these programs, we get entertained, we realizing that we're reckoning with things that deeply trouble us, but they act kind of as a bromide. They make us feel better. We laugh, and then we can move on. We're not quite as troubled. So in that way, the satire may actually have the contrary effect of preventing people from taking to the streets. I've also looked a little bit, I think there might be some connection between the two, but I've also looked a little bit on the types of humor in oppressive regimes, repressive regimes, that is repressing freedom of communication. There's a study of jokes in Hitler's Germany. There was a corpus of jokes that were going around. Not surprisingly, they tended to be muted below the radar screen, but they took on a particular quality. They tended to focus on censorship, actually. There's also, just to give you another example, humor in China. There's apparently, I'm not an expert in Mandarin or the Chinese language, but there's apparently lots of opportunity for puns in Mandarin because it's a tonal language, so that there's a lot of jokes that actually take the form of puns, and they can be used as a form of communication to express, revolt, express disapproval with authoritative action. What's the result? The Chinese entity that's in charge of communication on the airwaves has in fact outlawed puns in China. The idea being that, the particular edict says that it's undermining the purity of the Mandarin language, but you can see that in fact, if this type of humor is a mode of protest, that it would be unpopular with the authorities. So there's your universe. I think I stayed kind of within the right amount of time, and like I said, I'm quite happy to answer questions. So you want me to go ahead, or
Yeah, we'll do that in the future.
Okay.